The will was read on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, everyone in Harlan Creek knew that Eleanor Voss had been left with nothing but a mule named Chester and 40 acres of rock-hard ground on the wrong side of the ridge. She sat in the lawyer's office on the straight-back chair and did not cry. She had known her father's brother for 31 years, and she had never once trusted him. And so she was not surprised when Silas Voss unfolded himself from the chair across the room and smiled at her, the way a man smiles when he has already won. The house, the barn, the south pasture, and the livestock, the lawyer read, his voice flat as a plank. To Silas Voss, as the sole male heir of the Voss family estate, Eleanor's hands rested in her lap. She was 26 years old. She had nursed her father through 2 winters of illness, kept the books on his farm for 4 years, and planted every row of the garden that fed them both. None of that was written in the will. None of that, apparently, counted for anything. Silas leaned toward her as they walked out into the cold November air. "You're welcome to stay on as a hired hand," he said pleasantly. "I'd pay fair wages." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I'll manage," she said. She walked back to the farm, her father's farm. Silas's farm now packed what belonged to her into 2 canvas bags and a wooden trunk, hitched Chester to the old wagon, loaded the trunk into the bed, and drove north along the creek road without looking back once. The 40 acres were hers by a separate deed her father had filed quietly 3 years earlier, a piece of land he had bought when Eleanor was nursing him through his first bad winter, when he must have suspected that Silas would find a way to take everything else. He had never mentioned it to her. She had found the deed folded inside a Bible he left on her pillow the morning he died, with a note in his shaking handwriting that said only, "It's not much, but it's yours. Make something of it." She stood at the edge of the 40 acres on a gray November afternoon and looked at what she had. The land ran along the base of a limestone ridge. There was a creek on the eastern edge, which was good. There was a stand of cottonwood along the creek bank, which was also good. There was nothing else. No structure of any kind. No shelter for Chester. No shelter for her. The ground was frozen solid by December. She set up a canvas tent that first week, banked it with pine boughs for warmth, and began to think. Eleanor Voss had always been a thinker. Her father used to say she was the only person he knew who could look at a problem from 6 directions before most people had finished reading it right side up. She sat in that cold tent at night with a lantern and her father's surveying notes and thought about what she had and what she could build and what she could build it from. The lumber would cost more than she had. She had counted her money carefully, $11.40, plus a small gold brooch her mother had left her that she was not willing to sell. Cedar logs would need to be hauled from the mountain, and she had only Chester, who was a fine mule, but was not, by himself, a logging operation. Stone would take months to cut and lay, and she did not have months. The temperature at night was already dropping into the single digits, and she was sleeping in a canvas tent. It was Chester who gave her the idea, in a manner of speaking. She had piled the last of the cut grass along the eastern wall of the tent to block the wind, and when she came out one morning and pressed her hand into the pile, she felt it, warmth. Actual, genuine warmth trapped inside the packed mass of dried grass. She stood in the frozen air with her hand buried in that pile of dried grass for a long time, thinking. Sod had been used on the plains for decades, she knew that. Prairie settlers had cut blocks of earth and grass and stacked them like bricks. But the ground here was too rocky and too frozen for sod cutting. What she had, however, was something the ranchers in the valley had been discarding for weeks, the cut straw and dried grass from the fall harvest, baled loosely by hand and left in rows at the edge of the harvested fields. Considered worthless once the grain was stripped out, she drove Chester into the valley the next morning and spoke to 3 different farmers. 2 of them laughed at her before she finished her sentence. The third one, an older man named Horace Elbert, who had farmed the same bottomland for 20 years, listened to her all the way through. "You're going to build a house," he said, "out of my grass bales." "Yes, sir," Eleanor said, "if you'll let me have them." Horace Elbert looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Chester. "I'll give you what I've got in the north field," he said, "about 60 bales. They're no good to me. But girl, I want you to understand something." He paused. "The wind-up on that ridge gets mean in January. Mean in a way that'll go straight through wood." "What makes you think it won't go straight through a pile of dried grass?" "Because dried grass is full of air," Eleanor said. And air, when it's trapped, doesn't move. And air that doesn't move doesn't carry cold. That's what keeps the inside of a haystack warm enough in winter that rabbits den in them. She met his eyes steadily. "I've thought it through, Mr. Elbert." He studied her face for another moment. "Take the Bales," he said. Word got around Harlan Creek the way word always got around a small town in winter, fast and slightly distorted. By the end of that week, people were saying Eleanor Voss, the one who lost her daddy's farm to Silas, had lost her mind as well, and was building herself a grass house up on the ridge like she expected the Lord to hold the wind back personally on her behalf. The women at the dry goods store shook their heads. The men at the feed supply offered opinions that were not worth repeating. A boy of about 15 actually rode out to the edge of her property and stood on the road watching her work for half an hour before she turned and looked at him directly, and he rode away without saying a word. Silas came by once. He pulled up in the buggy he had bought with money from selling 2 of her father's horses and looked at the stacks of bales she had already laid in place, the rough timber frame she had notched and raised herself, the way she was pressing each bale tight against the next one and pinning them with sharpened stakes. "Eleanor," he said, in the voice of a man being very patient with someone unreasonable, "this won't last through February." She didn't look up from the bale she was positioning. "Noted," she said. "I'm serious. That material will rot. It'll collapse. And when it does, you'll be standing out here in the cold with nowhere to go." He paused. "The offer still stands. Hired hand. Fair wages." Eleanor set the bale. She picked up the next one. "Thank you for stopping by, Silas," she said. He left. She worked from first light to last light every day, and some days passed last light by lantern. The construction was not simple. She had reasoned it out carefully and knew that bales alone would not be enough. She notched upright timber posts at each corner and at intervals along the walls, anchoring them deep in the rocky ground with stones packed tight around the bases. The bales stacked between and around the posts, each course offset from the one below like bricks. She plastered the exterior with a mixture of clay and straw she had worked by hand into a thick paste, pressing it into every gap and surface until the outer walls were sealed solid. The interior walls she coated with the same mixture, and then again with a finer lime wash. She mixed herself from limestone. She burned and slaked in a barrel. The roof was the hardest part. She built it low and steep, the ridgepole supported by a central post she had dragged in from the cottonwoods and stripped and shaped with her own hands. The roofing was split cedar shakes. She had traded for 2 days of bookkeeping work for the Elbert family in exchange for a bundle of shakes Horace had stored in his barn. She laid them herself, working from the eaves up, overlapping each course. Chester she sheltered in a 3-sided structure she built in 4 hours from cut cottonwood poles and a heavy canvas tarp weighted with stones. She lined the floor with 2 feet of packed straw and hung old feed sacks over the open side to block the wind. He was warm enough. She checked him every night before she went to bed and every morning before she started work. Chester mattered. Chester was the only reason she had been able to move the bales and the timber and everything else. Chester had earned his comfort. She finished the main walls the last week of December. She chinked the final gaps, sealed the window frames, 2 small windows, each with a piece of oiled hide stretched tight across the opening, translucent enough to let in gray light, and hung the door she had built from split planks and leather hinges. She stood outside in the last thin light of December and looked at what she had built. It did not look like much from the outside. Low and thick and earthen-colored, it looked more like something that had grown out of the ridge than something a person had built. The plastered walls were rough. The roof was plain. There were no fine lines anywhere about it, but Eleanor had not been building for fine lines. The night she moved in, the temperature dropped to 11 degrees. She built a small fire in the clay and stone firebox she had constructed in the center of the single room, using the minimum of fuel just enough to take the edge off, and then she sat back and waited. The fire burned low. She let it. The room stayed warm. Not just bearable. Warm. The kind of warm that settles into your shoulders and unclenches something you didn't know you'd been holding tight. She pressed her hand flat against the interior wall and felt it not cold, not even cool. The bales on the other side of that plaster were doing exactly what she had said they would do, trapping air, holding heat, turning the brutal January cold into something the small fire could actually fight and win. She slept that night without her coat for the first time in 6 weeks. January came in hard. The first storm hit on the 5th, dropping 8 inches of snow and driving wind that stripped bark from the cottonwoods along the creek. Eleanor pulled the door shut fast each time she went out. She had thought about this, thought about the way cold air sinks and warm air rises, and she moved quickly and deliberately every time she crossed the threshold, never standing half in and half out, never letting the heat bleed away for the sake of looking at the sky. She brought Chester his water before it could freeze in the barrel. She kept her woodpile under the overhang she'd built on the south wall. She had thought about all of it. The second storm came on the 17th of January, and that one was different. She heard it before she saw it, a sound like the ridge itself was groaning, a pressure change in the air that made Chester move restlessly in his shelter, and made Eleanor set down what she was doing and walk to the window and press her eye to the gap at the edge of the oiled hide. The sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise. She brought in every piece of wood she could carry in 3 trips, stacked it against the interior wall, hung an extra canvas over the door, wedged the base with a rolled blanket, and built the fire up to a solid, steady burn. Then she sat down in the center of the room, wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders, and listened to the blizzard arrive. It arrived like a judgment. The wind hit the walls, and Eleanor felt the building shudder once, absorb it, and hold. She heard the sound of it, not just wind, but the shrieking, grinding howl of a plains blizzard at full force, the kind of storm that had killed cattle by the hundreds and settlers by the dozens in this country. She sat in her thick-walled, low-roofed, earth-plastered, straw bale house, and felt the storm try to find a way through, and fail, and try again. The fire needed almost no feeding. The room temperature dropped perhaps 4 degrees over the first 3 hours of the storm, and then steadied there, held by the walls, while outside the temperature fell to somewhere below 0, and kept going. It was on the second day of the storm that she heard the knocking. She almost didn't answer it. The sound barely made it through the wall. That was the first thing she noticed, how muffled it was, how the thick bales swallowed sound the same way they swallowed cold. She moved to the door, unwedged the blanket at the base, and opened it quickly. 3 people stood in the snow. She recognized them. Margaret Holm from the Valley Road, Margaret's son Thomas, who was 11 years old, and an older man, she knew only slightly, a Swedish immigrant named Lars Bergstrom, who had a claim about 2 miles west. They were covered in snow. Thomas's lips had gone the color of slate. Eleanor pulled them inside in 2 seconds and got the door shut. "Our chimney blocked," Margaret said, when she could speak. She was shaking so hard her words came out fragmented. The snow came over the roof edge and packed into the flue. The fire went out, and the smoke, we couldn't breathe inside. We had to leave. "How long were you outside?" Eleanor asked. She was already unwrapping Thomas, pulling the frozen outer layer off him, moving him toward the fire. "An hour," Lars Bergstrom said quietly. "Maybe more." Eleanor did not say anything about the irony of who was standing in her house. Margaret Holm had been one of the women at the dry goods store who shook her head. She did not say anything about that. She put Thomas directly in front of the fire with 2 wool blankets over his shoulders and got water heating in the small pot and pressed a tin cup of warm water into Margaret's hands and then into Lars's hands, and then she set about making the room work for 4 people instead of 1. The storm ran for another 36 hours. On the second night of it, with Thomas asleep near the fire and Margaret and Lars sitting quietly against the wall, Margaret said, without looking up, "It's warmer in here than my house was on a good day." Eleanor was mending a split seam on her boot by lantern light. "The walls hold it," she said simply. "I didn't think it would work," Margaret said. "I know," Eleanor said. There was a long pause. The wind pushed at the walls and the walls gave it nothing. "How did you know?" Margaret asked. "That it would?" Eleanor set down the boot and thought about how to answer that honestly. "I didn't know for certain," she said finally. "I knew the physics of it. I knew trapped air doesn't move and moving air is what carries cold. I knew prairie settlers had used sod and it worked on the same principle. And I knew—" She paused. "I knew I didn't have any other option. So I thought it through until I was as sure as I could be, and then I built it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Your father used to say you were the sharpest mind in the valley," she said. "I thought that was just a father talking." Eleanor looked at her. "It wasn't," she said, without any particular pride in it, just as a statement of fact. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 20th. The world outside was white and still and brutally cold, but still. Eleanor opened the door and looked out at it, 3 feet of new snow. The cottonwoods bent under the weight of it. Chester standing in his shelter, looking deeply unimpressed, alive and warm, his water barrel frozen on the outside and thawed on the inside from the heat of his body and the packed straw around him. She dug a path to him first. She always did. Word traveled fast after that, the way word always travels in small towns when the story is a good one. Margaret Holm told everyone she talked to for the next 2 weeks about the inside of Eleanor's house, about how warm it was, about how the walls didn't shake, about how Thomas slept through the second night of the worst blizzard in 4 years, tucked up next to a small fire in a house made of grass and clay and a young woman's thinking. Some people were skeptical. Some people drove out to look at the structure from the road and went home shaking their heads. Some people asked to come inside and look, and Eleanor let them, and she answered their questions plainly and without embellishment, and she showed them the walls where she had cut a small test section, and you could see the bale cross-section, the hollow stalks packed tight, the air caught inside each one. Horace Elbert came in February and walked around the outside and the inside twice, quietly, and then said, "I'll be damned," which from Horace was high praise. A man from the territorial newspaper rode out in early March and took notes while Eleanor explained the construction from foundation to ridgepole. The article ran 2 weeks later under the headline, "Young Woman's Ingenuity Weathers the Season's Worst Storm." The article mentioned that 3 Valley residents had sheltered in the structure during the January blizzard and reported it warmer than their own timber-framed homes. Silas Voss read the article. She heard about his reaction secondhand, which was that he said nothing at all, only folded the paper carefully and set it on the table, which for Silas was the equivalent of a lengthy silence. Eleanor did not gloat. Gloating had never interested her. She had a house that worked, a mule that was alive and well, 40 acres of land that were hers without question or complication, and the clearest proof she had ever needed that thinking a problem through to its end, and then doing the work, he was worth more than waiting for someone to hand you what you deserved. In the spring, she extended the structure a second room off the east wall. Same construction, better fitted windows with real glass she had saved for through the winter. She planted the south-facing ground and kitchen garden. She drove Chester down to the valley twice a week and did accounts and bookkeeping for 3 different farm operations, building a small, steady income that she tracked in a notebook with the same careful precision she applied to everything. By the following winter, 2 other homesteaders on the ridge had come to her asking about the construction method. She showed them both, step by step, without charging anything for the information. One of them was a young couple with a baby who had been living in a dugout that flooded in the spring rains. The other was an old trapper named Clarence, who had been sleeping in a sod-roofed shed for 6 years and whose joints hurt him badly in the cold. She helped them both. There was a moment, in December of that second year, when Eleanor stood outside in the early dark and looked at the 3 structures that now sat on or near her ridge, hers in the center, the young couple's to the south, Clarence's to the north, all 3 low and thick and earthen-colored, all 3 with thin threads of smoke rising from their chimneys into the cold, clear air. She thought about her father's note. "It's not much, but it's yours. Make something of it." She had made something of it. She went inside. She shut the door quickly and completely, the way she always did. The fire was small and steady, and the room was warm, and Chester was settled in his shelter with his water and his straw, and the wind that was building again out of the northwest could push at the walls all it wanted. The walls would give it nothing. They never did. When the world takes something from you that you believed was yours, it can feel like the end. But Eleanor's story reminds us that what we carry inside, the willingness to think deeply, to work faithfully, and to help others even when no one helped us, can never be taken away. Sometimes the coldest winters just reveal what we were already capable of building all along. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted purely to bring you an enjoyable listen while leaving something warm and useful behind. A little reminder that your own resourcefulness might be exactly the shelter someone else needs too.